6. Operation Eiche. When Adolf Hitler received news that Benito Mussolini had been removed from power in Italy, the leader of the Nazi party flew into a rage. His Axis partner had been betrayed and was driven from office by traitors within the country's government and armed forces. After learning this information, Hitler almost outright invaded Italy, kidnapped members of the Italian royal family, arrested newly appointed officials in Italy's government, and he even considered capturing the Pope in retaliation. However, those around him convinced him to instead plan Mussolini's rescue. The operation was known as Operation Eiche. The Germans were able to pinpoint Mussolini's location after intercepting a radio message. Italy's former prime minister had been moved a total of 6 times in order to ensure that he was secure. Those involved in Operation Eiche determined that he was being held at a luxury hotel in the Abruzzi Mountains, known as the Albergo Rufigo. The hotel was fairly secluded, situated at a height of 7,000 feet above sea level, adding to the security measures that had already been taken. SS Major Otto Skorzeny, a man who was nicknamed the most dangerous man in Europe, was summoned by Hitler to create a plan to rescue Mussolini. So Otto assembled a force of 90 airborne troops to get the job done. He determined that the best course of action would be to send his team in by glider to overpower the resistance. Then they would be tasked with flying Mussolini to safety on a light aircraft called a Fieseler Storch. On September 12, 1943, German troops captured the rail line that connected the valley floor up to the side of the elevated mountain, which ensured that Italian reinforcements wouldn't interfere with their rescue mission. Otto's glider men then landed near the hotel before surprising and capturing Mussolini's guards. The frail former dictator was subsequently escorted to the waiting Fieseler Storch. The weight limit was exceeded on the aircraft, but it surprisingly made it to its intended destination at a Luftwaffe airfield. From there, Mussolini was boarded onto a Heinkel HE-111 bomber and was transported to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia called Wolf's Lair. Once he arrived, he was greeted by his friend Hitler, who was shocked to see his appearance. Mussolini was no longer the powerful leader of fascist Italy, but instead a refugee without a country. The Nazis then attempted to take advantage of whatever pro-fascist sentiment remained in Italy. They installed Mussolini as the ruler of a puppet regime called the Italian Socialist Republic in Salo, a town on Lake Garda located in northern Italy. However, very few men supported the former prime minister because, to most people in the country, his days were already numbered. 5. Casa Winter. Casa Winter, located in the Canary Islands, looks like an ordinary home. You wouldn't know it once had ties with the Nazi party. The building's name, Casa Winter, doesn't make much sense when compared to its views over a picturesque landscape that forms a section of the Giandia Natural Park. The home can be seen from the beach of Cafet on Forteventura's harsh southern tip, forcing many to wonder why someone would build a house so high up on the hillside. The current occupant of Casa Winter, Pedro Fumero, believes he's sleeping on top of what was once a secret Nazi base, designed initially as a hideaway. The 48-year-old retired taxi driver moved into the home in 2012. However, Fumero, his aunt, and 2 of his uncles who also lived there are now facing an eviction notice. A hotel company purchased the property from Gustav Winter's living descendants. Gustav was a German engineer who occupied the house in the early 1900s. His unusual wartime activities in the Canary Islands definitely attracted the attention of Allied spies. He was born in Germany's Black Forest region in the year 1893. He faced accusations of being a Nazi agent toward the end of World War II. But like many other Germans on the Allies' list of suspected Nazis, Winter was never seized by the Spanish authorities. Instead, he died in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in 1971. According to his research, Fumero believes that Gustav Winter was likely provisioning German submarines. While exploring the property, Fumero found a battery that he thinks came from a Nazi U-boat. As he stood inside the home's turret-like construction on the building's upper level, he told reporter James Badcock with the BBC that Casa Winter was never a house meant for enjoyment. Evidence of his theory was revealed in 1947 when a CIA document was released in which Gustav Winter is called a radio and military operator. The document also states that Gustav was responsible for supplying German U-boats, and while the structure was technically built in 1946 on paper, Fumero claims that the base of the building was actually laid down much earlier. He claims this to be true based on documents that allegedly show that Gustav Winter purchased the entire Jandia Peninsula from the previous Spanish landowner after General Franco became the dictatorial ruler of Spain in 1939. Under General Franco's command, Spain declared itself to be neutral during the outbreak of World War II. However, the country continued to supply volunteer soldiers, minerals, and in locations like the Canary Islands, logistical support for the Nazi Party. 4. Successful sabotage. The Norwegian mission known as Operation Gunnerside was a huge success. It's been memorialized in many books, movies, and TV shows. The sabotage of Telemark County's Vemork chemical plant in Nazi-occupied Norway was one of the most important and dramatic military missions of World War II. It ultimately put the German nuclear scientists way behind and allowed the US to beat the Germans in the quest to create the first ever atomic bomb. Most people associate America's atomic bomb efforts, nicknamed the Manhattan Project, with the country of Japan, as well as the war in the Pacific. However, the program was actually created in reaction to suspicions that the Germans were trying to pursue a similar weapon. But in the end, the fighting in Europe ceased before either side finished working on the bomb. In fact, America's first atomic bomb detonation test was done on May 7, 1945, the same day that Germany surrendered. And so, when the US finished their bomb, it was completed far too late for use against the Germans. And if German scientists had developed their own atomic bomb just a couple of months earlier, the outcome of the war might have been entirely different. Operation Gunnerside, sabotage of the Vemork chemical plant, very well may have prevented a Nazi victory. Leif Tronstad, a Norwegian Royal Army colonel, was tasked with leading the mission. The strategy was to have an elite group of soldiers parachute into the wilderness surrounding the plant. Once they landed, they were ordered to ski their way to the Vemork chemical plant. Instead of using force to gain entry, they would use stealth to get inside. They would then destroy the building's heavy water production room with explosives. And this is exactly what the 11-man group achieved on February 16, 1943. Miraculously, not a single shot was fired, and no lives were lost on either side. Where do you think the world would be today if Hitler won the Second World War? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 3. Operation Greif. Operation Greif was a German military mission headed by Hitler. The project involved training soldiers to infiltrate Allied territory. Once inside enemy lines, the German soldiers would cause chaos and confusion among the real American troops. The secret operation was so covert that many German officers weren't aware of its existence until the day it launched. In order to trick US and military leaders, German troops would disguise themselves by wearing Allied uniforms. And while you may think this plan sounds just crazy enough to work, you'd be wrong. While the mission succeeded in creating confusion and paranoia within Allied territory, it did nothing to strengthen Hitler's last attempt at the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last offensive campaign during World War II on the Western Front. Hitler planned to amass his own forces in Western Europe in order to launch a huge counter-offensive against the sparsely spread Allied forces in the Ardennes of France. His end goal was to slice his way through the Allied lines, and he wanted to retake the vital port in Antwerp, Belgium. Hitler's first step was to capture and destroy the bridges of the Meuse River. The only hope of success was to take the Americans and the British by complete surprise, so Hitler's plan was kept entirely confidential. However, even the German officers that knew of the plan were skeptical that it would succeed. One such officer even said, "The entire offensive has not more than a 10% chance of success." But Hitler didn't want to leave anything up to chance, so he found a man that he believed could sway the odds in his favor. SS Major Otto Skorzeny was once again summoned by Hitler after his team's success in Operation Eiche. He was then briefed by Hitler on what he described to be the most important assignment of his life. Otto was responsible for training several small groups of German soldiers to infiltrate Allied territory while dressed in American uniforms. These men were then tasked with creating as much chaos as possible for the Allies before the Germans invaded the Meuse bridges. Otto apparently had no issues in risking the lives of his men or violating international agreements, so he was the perfect man for the job. Operation Greif was officially created in order to destroy ammunition dumps and bridges, as well as pass false orders onto any and all US units that the covert German soldiers encountered while behind enemy lines. They also planned to reverse road signs, remove minefield warnings, and block off roads with phony threats. However, Otto and his team would only partially succeed in their goals. Despite many holes in their plans, including that only 400 of the 2,500 men that were chosen for the mission could speak colloquial English, and only 10 were fluent after weeks of practicing, the mission was launched on December 16, 1944. At first, the Americans were caught completely off guard, as the German soldiers were able to infiltrate deep into their lines. As chaos and panic ensued, the Allied High Command desperately attempted to come up with a defense plan. However, when 4 German soldiers wearing American uniforms were stopped by US military police in a jeep near a bridge, they were unable to produce proper paperwork. The officers were suspicious of the men, so they searched the vehicle. They ended up finding swastika emblems, explosives, and other concealed weapons, prompting them to be interrogated for information. One of Operation Greif's commandos claimed that they'd been tasked with penetrating Paris and capturing General Eisenhower, as well as several other high-ranking officers, sparking utter paranoia in the American forces. In order to capture all the remaining Germans that gained access behind Allied lines, US soldiers soon created a set of security questions that sometimes had unintentionally comical results. The members of Operation Greif had been thoroughly trained in American slang, so checkpoint guards had to come up with questions they believed only a fellow American would be able to answer. Questions like, what's Sinatra's first name? And what's the name of the president's dog? These checkpoint questions failed to take into account the British soldiers that suddenly found themselves at a huge disadvantage. Some American officers, including the highest-ranking ones, weren't immune to mistakes either. Bruce Clark, a brigadier general, was once arrested for half an hour after giving an incorrect answer about the Chicago Cubs. In the end, Operation Greif succeeded in creating chaos amongst the Americans, but it failed to meet the mission's ultimate goal. The Allies put up fierce resistance, and the German commandos weren't able to destroy any communication lines or bridges. And most of the Germans that were captured wearing American uniforms were quickly tried and sent before a firing squad. 2. Wrath of God. The covert assassination campaign known as Operation Wrath of God was carried out by Israel in order to avenge the kidnapping and slaying of 11 Israeli athletes by certain Palestinian militants at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Even though Israel had targeted the heads of organizations such as the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) and Fatah, the country's assassinations dramatically escalated following the massacre in Munich. A secret committee led by Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized the murder of everyone that was involved with the breakaway militant faction known as Black September, the group responsible for the Munich assassinations. The hit squad involved in Operation Wrath of God, codenamed Bayonet, consisted of members of Israel's foreign intelligence agency called Mossad. It was also supported by several Israeli Defense Forces special operations teams. The assassin group spent years tracking down and murdering those suspected of participating in the Munich massacre. 3 out of the 8 militants that were responsible for killing the athletes survived the murder attempts, and they were released from custody several weeks later by the West German government in exchange for the crew members of a hijacked Lufthansa jet. The 5 other men were killed in a gun battle with police during an unsuccessful attempt to save the hostages. 1. Montana de la Altura. The Santa Cruz to Tenerife Port Authority houses half a century's worth of history in a large warehouse called Montana de la Altura. Next to the storage building is the Miguel Pinto Gonzalez Early Childhood and Primary Education Center, whose managers use the facility to store old desks and other materials. You wouldn't initially see La Altura's warlike purposes from the outside, but deep within the mountain located in the port city of Tenerife is a military base. This base is where the first Franco regime came up with plans to defend the Canary Islands during the Second World War. 3 huge vaults that stretch 558 feet are hidden in the mountain, interconnected by giant galleries. These galleries reach the very top of the mountain, and they were intended to be hidden within the earth until they were connected to a nearby volcanic tube, a project that was never finished. The vaults and warehouse were originally constructed in the 1940s as a logistics base by the Spanish army in order to supply submarines, but surprisingly, there were never any subs stored here. It was built to be the official naval station of Tenerife, and it was meant to complement the naval efforts already being carried out in Gran Canaria. Once the base was completed, the war was over, and there were no longer any submarines to store in the mountain. And so the installation was given to the Port Authority, where it now keeps its treasures, such as a humber car that was once driven by the Port Authority's president, and air pumps for divers. Apparently, this place might become a museum in the future. The facility has an exit at the base of the mountain that leads right onto the beach that lies below it. However, this door was sealed years ago for security purposes.
8. Cologne Cathedral Tank Skirmish. Prior to World War II, Cologne was Germany's 4th largest city with around 800,000 residents. It was a major transportation hub and became an important industrial center for manufacturing war supplies, making it an appealing target to the Allies. Throughout the conflict, the British Royal Air Force bombed Cologne in 262 different air raids that were launched as a response to the Germans bombing London. By March of 1945, the city was essentially reduced to rubble and only 20,000 residents remained. On the night of March 3rd, the Allies dropped anti-Nazi propaganda leaflets from airplanes, letting civilians know that they didn't have to fear the advancing troops and urging them not to evacuate. 2 days later, they launched a 3-pronged invasion into Cologne and toward the city's center as part of Operation Lumberjack, a plan to capture key German cities along the western bank of the Rhine River. In a harrowing encounter that was captured on film, 2 advancing American Sherman tanks got stuck on a pile of rubble at Cologne Cathedral, one of the only buildings that was still standing, as a German Panther tank pelted the Shermans with 75mm shells. A nearby US Pershing tank approached the scene. The German tank commander mistook it for one of his own and told the gunner to hold his fire, giving the Pershing the perfect opportunity to take out the Panther. Within 2 days, the Allies had captured all of Cologne west of the Rhine, and by mid-April, they seized control of the rest of the city. 7. A truce in the forest. Also known as the Ardennes Offensive, Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive campaign on the Western Front during World War II. It lasted from December 16, 1944 to January 28, 1945, and took place near a tiny hunting cabin near the German-Belgian border, where a young boy named Fritz Winken, with his mother, hometown of Aachen, was partially destroyed in a bombing raid. Just 8 days into the battle on Christmas Eve, there was a knock on the Winken family's front door. Fritz's mother answered the door to find 2 American soldiers standing there, along with a 3rd injured soldier who was sitting on the ground. The trio had gotten separated from their battalion in the freezing cold, and the man on the ground had a life-threatening bullet wound to his leg. To the youngster's surprise, his mother invited the enemy troops inside and prepared a holiday meal for them. The men introduced themselves as Jim, Robin, and Harry. Everyone was about to sit down to eat when there was another knock at the door. Thinking it would be more Americans, Winken opened the door without hesitation, only to be greeted by 4 Wehrmacht soldiers. It was considered high treason to shelter enemy soldiers, and little boy and his mother were frozen with fear about the consequence they might suffer for having Americans inside their cabin. To their surprise, the Germans politely explained that they had gotten separated from their regiment and asked for permission to spend the night. Before letting them in, Fritz's mother told them about the guests inside and warned them that she would have no gunfire in her house. At first, the Germans seemed taken aback and perhaps a little unhappy about what they were hearing. But Mrs. Vinken implored them to forget about killing for one night and ordered them to put their weapons down. They complied, and when the Americans saw them doing it, they also handed their guns over to Fritz's mother. And in that tiny cabin, where there was scarcely enough seating for everyone, the enemy soldiers peacefully shared a meal. As the night wore on, their initial suspicions wore off. They got along like old friends. The next morning, they parted ways and went back to being on opposite sides of the battlefield. 6. The strike on Taranto. On the night of November 11, 1940, roughly 5 months after Italy entered World War II, 21 British swordfish biplanes bombed the Italian naval fleet at Taranto harbor. By then, the aircraft was obsolete, yet Taranto was powerful. But regaining control of the Mediterranean from the Axis powers after Italy's entry into the conflict was crucial to the Allied war effort, and the operation proceeded despite the RAF's outdated air power. The raid, also known as Operation Judgment, was carried out in 2 waves, with 12 of the aircraft making the initial attack and the rest of the swordfish striking 90 minutes later, pelted the Italian ships with torpedoes, flares, and bombs, catching the enemy completely off guard. Within the first few minutes of the raid, 3 major Italian battleships were taken out of action. 4 others were damaged. The Italians fought back against the British with heavy anti-aircraft fire, but they failed to gain the upper hand in the skirmish. In one fell swoop, the British wiped out half of Italy's battle fleet, delivering a blow that the country's navy, or its military in general, never fully recovered from throughout the rest of the war. On several occasions over the next 3 years, the Italian fleet chose not to fight against the now superior British Royal Navy. 5. The Anzio landings. In January 1944, about 6 months into the Italian campaign, Allied forces had gotten bogged down at a series of Axis fortifications across central Italy. Fortifications known as the Gustav Line prevented them from reaching Rome like they had planned. Troops were exhausted from the amount of fighting it took for them to get that far, and morale was low. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came up with the idea of circumventing the German fortifications by launching an amphibious attack on the coastal town of Anzio along Italy's western shore. If the invasion required Axis forces to pull troops away from the Gustav Line to defend Rome, it would make it a lot easier for the Allies to breach the Gustav Line. And if the Axis failed to pull troops away from the Gustav Line to defend Rome, the city would be vulnerable to capture, which would isolate Axis troops at the Gustav Line and essentially leave them at the mercy of the Allies. As long as the Axis forces didn't have enough manpower to defend both Rome and the Gustav Line, the Allies had a good chance of obtaining their objective. U.S. Army Major General John Lucas thought the plan would fail, that the Allies had far too little manpower, but he was ordered to proceed. And on January 22, 1944, 36,000 soldiers and 3,200 vehicles arrived on the shore of Anzio. Their arrival went practically unopposed by the enemy at first, giving Lucas a chance to make advantageous moves. But his lack of confidence in the operation made him reluctant to act, giving the Axis forces an opportunity to launch a more powerful defense than the Allies had prepared for. For more than 3 months, the adversaries engaged in a war of attrition. In other words, both sides were trying to wear the enemy down to the point where they were too weak to fight. The Allies finally launched a major offensive on the Gustav Line in late May. At the same time, Polish soldiers captured nearby Monte Cassino. This final exasperated push forced German troops to retreat north of Rome. While the Allies technically won the painstaking face-off, it wasn't exactly a victory to brag about. But they had seized Rome and could proceed with the next chapter of the Italian campaign, which was now undeniably tipping in their favor. How do you think this would have played out if General John Lucas had more faith in the plan? Tell us in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. The Allied invasion of Sicily. Before dawn on July 10, 1943. About a year before the D-Day landings at Normandy, Allied forces invaded German-occupied Sicily in what was, at that point, the largest amphibious operation in history. About 478,000 British and American troops stormed the island, where they expected to encounter 300,000 enemy soldiers. Also known as Operation Husky, it was the Allies' first step back into Axis-occupied Europe and marked the beginning of the Italian campaign. The Germans fought back fiercely as Allied troops arrived by air and sea on different parts of the island. To distract the Nazis away from meaningful combat, the Allies staged several false operations, which proved key to weakening their opponent. By late July, the Allies began capturing key territories, squeezing the Germans into increasingly small pockets of the island. At the same time, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was overthrown, leaving Hitler feeling unusually defeated. In a rare instance of the Nazi tyrant backing down to the enemy, he gave his military leaders permission to leave Sicily. On the night of August 11th, around 100,000 Axis troops were evacuated to mainland Italy overnight. Just days later, the Allies officially declared victory, marking a critical step in retaking Axis-occupied territory. 3. Operation Bagration. On the night of June 21, 1944, the Soviet Red Army launched the first attacks of World War II's largest Allied offensive, codenamed Operation Bagration, in German-occupied Byelorussia, known today as Belarus. By then, the Russians had deceived the Germans into thinking their summer offensive would be focused in Ukraine, and the Nazis had diverted some of their manpower away from the actual planned attack location. The campaign was carried out in 3 phases over a roughly 2-month period, with a 2.3 million strong force that was armed to the hilt with artillery, tanks, explosives, and guns. The Soviets squashed the German resistance, destroying 3 Axis armies and ripping the Eastern Front wide open as they plowed their way through Byelorussia. In what's been described as a series of brilliant but brutal assaults, the Red Army struck when and where the Nazis least expected it. They advanced hundreds of miles in a remarkably short period, pushing their way into Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe, and the Baltic region. The Russians also attacked Axis forces in Romania and crippled Bulgaria's troops, ending the country's involvement in the war. When Operation Bagration ended on August 19th, the Red Army had completely retaken Byelorussia and were gaining ground in eastern Poland. Germany suffered an estimated 450,000 casualties, and another 300,000 soldiers spent nearly a year surrounded by the Soviet military and helplessly separated from other Nazi forces. The Russians also suffered heavy casualties, including 180,000 killed or missing. But they accomplished their biggest defeat in German military history and gained access to territories that put them within striking distance of Berlin, marking a major turning point in favor of the Allies. 2. Warsaw Uprising. In July 1944, the Soviet Red Army advanced through German-occupied Belarus and toward Poland, covering as much as 25 miles per day. By the end of the month, they had nearly reached Warsaw's outskirts, and the Germans had evacuated the city. Hitler ordered his retreating troops to return to Warsaw, where they told the Poles to prepare for battle against the Red Army. But the Polish underground resistance, known as the Polish Home Army, had other ideas. The clandestine movement was formed in 1939 after the city fell to the Nazis and grew to include 38,000 members in Warsaw alone. But these resistance fighters lacked the vehicles, guns, and ammunition to realistically win a fight against the Nazis. Encouraged by the Red Army's impending arrival, General Tadeusz Komorowski ordered the ragtag force to attack the returning Nazis on August 1st. The Germans were taken by surprise, and the Poles managed to capture several neighborhoods while heavy fighting continued elsewhere throughout Warsaw. Within days, the already under-equipped Poles began to run low on ammunition, but they could hear the Red Army fighting with the Germans just a few miles away. So they held out, confident that the Russians would arrive soon. But it didn't happen. According to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, his troops were exhausted and needed to rest and resupply. He refused to allow American or British aircraft to land on what was now considered Soviet soil, leaving the Polish Home Army on its own against the Germans. Hitler ordered his troops to exterminate all of the resistance fighters and destroy Warsaw, and he sent reinforcements in for backup. The Red Army was just 10 miles away, 16 kilometers the entire time. But Stalin didn't think the Poles deserved any help. Meanwhile, the Nazis laid siege to Warsaw and the people in it, killing an estimated 150,000 Poles and leaving the city in shambles. The survivors were marched out of Warsaw and into the gas chambers, where they were executed. 1. The Ardennes Offensive. By late 1944, it was clear that the Allies were winning the war. It started to feel like it would be all over soon. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up his quest for world dominance. He launched a surprise attack on the Allies in hopes of turning the war back in his favor. In what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans cut through the densely forested Ardennes region between Belgium and Luxembourg to reach a vast stretch of front where tens of thousands of US troops were spread out. The Americans were caught completely off guard when they awoke to Nazi tanks barreling straight at them in what would be the heaviest artillery bombardment that many, if not most of them, had ever experienced. But they fought back fiercely against the Germans and quick to block roads that were critical to achieving a Nazi victory. An estimated 450,000 Germans participated in the Ardennes Offensive, but they represented the absolute last of the country's able-bodied fighters. Battle lasted for around 6 weeks, and somewhere between 63,000 and 98,000 German troops were killed. Hitler's depleted armored forces and Luftwaffe personnel were never replaced. While the Allies ultimately won the battle, their victory came at a high cost. Of the 610,000 American troops that fought, around 89,000 died, making the Bulge the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the US during the war, and the third deadliest campaign in the country's history. 8. Project Habakkuk. During World War II, British War Office scientist Geoffrey Pike proposed turning icebergs into aircraft carriers as a way to save money. It would be used as an alternative to using conventional building materials, which were in short supply at the time. After receiving the go-ahead from Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1943, military engineers began designing what they hoped would be a fortified iceberg that was both economically efficient and convenient to repair. Assuming everything went according to plan, each aircraft carrier would be 2,000 feet long and 200 feet wide. That's more than twice the size of the Titanic and would have room for 300 aircraft. A 60-foot-long, 18 meters prototype was built in Canada's Lake Patricia using a mixture of ice, wood, tar, and refrigeration pipes. It was functional but impractical, raising obvious questions about whether it was realistic to use ice as a building material and if it would be worth the cost of keeping the ice cool. In the meantime, the need for aircraft carriers decreased thanks to the introduction of planes that could fly for longer periods, the availability of Iceland as a permanent base, and the development of radar that tracked U-boats more accurately. Just months after it began, Project Habakkuk was abandoned in favor of other projects that better suited the military's needs. 7. Secret Service anti-espionage operations. In 1915, nearly 2 full years before the United States officially entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson tasked the Secret Service with intercepting and disrupting a German sabotage network that was plotting against the US, England, and France. An 11-member counter-espionage unit was formed in New York City, where they performed surveillance on a meeting between a German sympathizer and his friend, Dr. Heinrich Albert. After ending the meeting and going separate ways, Albert boarded a train, unaware that Secret Service operative Frank Burke was watching his every move. In a hurry to disembark at his stop, Albert left the briefcase on the train. It only took him a split second to realize it, but by then, Burke had snatched the briefcase and was leaving the scene. Albert tried to chase after him, but never caught up. 2 days later, he posted an ad in the paper offering a $20 reward for the return of the briefcase. By then, the Secret Service had thoroughly examined its contents, which included a treasure trove of detailed plots to interfere with the Allied cause. The documents revealed that Albert was Germany's top financial agent in the US, and that he had received around $27 million to fund espionage activities on American soil. These efforts included disruptions to manufacturing and shipping, influencing public opinion through the purchase of powerful publishing companies, imposing an embargo on munitions shipments, and other strategies for undermining the US and its allies. Perhaps most disturbingly, the briefcase contained a plan to have 85,000 German soldiers land on the New Jersey coast with the goal of isolating New York City from the rest of the country within 24 hours. Thankfully, that never happened, and the espionage ring was broken up. 6. Pre-war espionage. During the early 1900s, Germany sought to increase its naval power while Britain scrambled to stay at least one step ahead. Tensions between the two nations worsened as the rivalry intensified in the years leading up to World War I. Paranoia ran high, and relations devolved to a crisis point. In January 1912, a German spy named Armgard Karl Graves traveled to Scotland under the guise of attending medical lectures. His true intentions were to gather information at naval bases, including any developments in weaponry and other equipment, and to observe the movement of Royal Navy vessels. The German spy network in the UK wasn't nearly as big or skilled as British leaders believed, but their heightened diligence paid off. They became aware that Graves was a secret agent within days of his arrival to Scotland and put him under surveillance while intercepting his mail. Graves realized he was being watched after investigators searched his room during a trip to London, and he was arrested a week later. His possessions revealed that he was communicating information through secret codes that were written down in a medical diary. Those who got to know Graves during his time in Scotland testified in court about his suspicious behavior, which included constant worries about his mail being interfered with and a seemingly excessive interest in naval affairs. He served 18 months in a Scottish prison, but was released early after promising to be a double agent. Graves was sent to the US after promising to procure a German spy master's list of agents, but he kept asking for money and failing to provide valuable intel, and was let go from the position. He published a book boasting about his successes as a spy, even though only he seemed to think he was ever good at the job. After getting convicted of fraud in the US and spending 3 years in prison, he was deported back to Germany. 5. Operation Tracer. For decades following World War II, rumors swirled about a secret chamber inside the Rock of Gibraltar, hidden somewhere among a 30-mile network of tunnels that the British military built during the conflict. Even after it became well known that these dark, narrow pathways housed a hospital, soldiers' barracks, and storage space for guns and ammunition, the secret chamber's existence remained unproven until relatively recently. Known as the Stay Behind Cave, the 45 by 16 by 8 foot base was built after the British discovered Hitler's plan to invade Gibraltar. It was constructed as part of a top-secret project called Operation Tracer, which called for a team of 6 men to observe the harbor from inside the cave. They would be sealed in with enough supplies to last them a year, including 10,000 gallons of water, along with radio equipment and power generators. Conditions would be extremely basic, with 2 small toilets, a sink, and essentially the bare minimum when it came to both necessities and comfort. The floor would be lined with cork to prevent any noise that might give their position away. The only way the team would ever exit the stay-behind cave was if the Allies defeated Germany before their provisions ran out. Otherwise, the secret room would become their tomb. They began their training, but the mission was called off as Hitler's priorities shifted away from Gibraltar. The chamber's equipment was removed and the area leading up to it was sealed off. Civilians spent years searching for the stay-behind cave while the government remained tight-lipped about its existence. It was finally discovered in 1996, offering a first-hand glimpse at the environment 6 soldiers were planning to live and possibly die in. If your government asked you to be a part of a top-secret mission, would you? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. The Ahnenerbe. Founded in 1935 by leading Nazi party member Heinrich Himmler, the Ahnenerbe was a think tank and SS faction devoted to finding evidence to back up their claims that Germans descended from a superior ancient Aryan race. The group consisted mainly of scientists and scholars from various disciplines who were, of course, on board with the Nazi agenda. In addition to crediting Aryans for most of humanity's major accomplishments throughout history, the Ahnenerbe argued that its racial doctrine was supported by scientific research. The vast majority of experts throughout the world disagreed, and still do. But Ahnenerbe scholars found ways to interpret the evidence to fit their narrative, and Hitler's government used their findings to justify many of its unspeakably cruel policies. Members of the organization even ventured out to different parts of Europe in search of artifacts connected to this alleged ancient race. In late 2015, a hermit living in Russia's Eiche mountains allegedly found a brown Ahnenerbe suitcase. He told the press that the case bore the group's insignia, along with 2 skulls belonging to unidentifiable creatures. It appears as though these objects were never studied by credible scholars, leaving their authenticity highly questionable. But news of the alleged discoveries left some wondering if, at the very least, Ahnenerbe members had come to the area in the quest to find their alleged Aryan roots. 3. Operation Bodyguard. One of the objectives of the 1944 D-Day landings at Normandy was to catch the Germans completely off guard. To prevent the Nazis from increasing their military presence in the region, the Allies initiated a campaign to deceive the enemy into thinking that they planned to attack elsewhere, known as Operation Bodyguard. This wouldn't be easy, since France was the most logical choice for an Allied invasion of Western Europe. Military officials were also highly skeptical that the plan would succeed due to the failure of a previous deception strategy. They nevertheless approved the operation, which aimed to mislead the Germans into thinking that the Allied invasion would come later than it was actually planned for, and that there would be attacks elsewhere, including in other parts of France as well as the Balkans, Norway, and Bulgaria. The details of these fictional plans were spread through leaked information from double agents, intercepted communications, false rumors, and threats of attacks in places the Allies had no real plans of invading. To enforce the false narrative and make the plan seem real, the Allies stationed fictional military units and staged phony operations in the places detailed in the bogus plans. Operation Bodyguard was extremely complex, with multiple smaller operations being carried out in various places as part of the bigger plan. It was a strategic success, staving off a large German presence at Normandy, while giving the Allies a chance to build a beachhead. And while there's no predicting how Normandy would have turned out in the absence of the operation, the ability to distract the Nazis enabled the Allies to take a much more prepared approach than they otherwise would have. 2. The Unknown Warrior. More than 1.1 million British soldiers died, went missing, and/or were taken prisoner during World War I. In 1920, Army chaplain David Railton MC came up with the idea of an anonymous grave to represent all the lives lost, but especially those who remained unaccounted for, and whose families had to cope with not knowing their fate or being able to give them a proper burial. Painstaking steps were taken to ensure that the identity of the unknown warrior would never be discovered. Exhumation parties disinterred 4 graves containing the bodies of unidentified British soldiers who died in different places and took the remains to a chapel where they were laid out and covered with flags. Brigadier General Louis John Wyatt selected the remains that would represent the unknown warrior, and they were placed in a casket and transported to London. The arrival of the body was a major event for the nation in mourning, with spectators lining the streets as horse-drawn carriage transported the remains to Westminster Abbey, where the casket was ceremoniously lowered into the ground. Dignitaries, state officials, the royal family, and senior military officers participated in the procession. While the point of the unknown warrior's grave is to never know the identity of the man who was laid to rest with such honor, of course, people have tried to find out who he is. The full details of the mission to unearth and choose the unknown warrior were never revealed. And while some think this means the government is hiding information in a deceptive fashion, the very concept of the memorial calls for some level of secrecy. Over the years, there's been speculation that those in power know the man's identity, but those involved in the process of choosing the remains adamantly insisted throughout their lives that this is untrue, and that nobody knows who the unknown warrior is or where his body came from. 1. Dieppe Raid. On August 19, 1942, a 6,000-strong force of Canadian and British troops attempted to launch an amphibious attack on the French port of Dieppe on the English Channel coast. They were spotted by a German patrol boat, and by the time they reached the shore, the Nazis were preparing and waiting. Within 10 hours, nearly 1,000 Allied soldiers were killed, close to 2,000 were taken prisoner, and more than 2,400 were wounded. The battle's failures have long been known, but it wasn't until 2021 that American historian Leah Garrett shined light on a previously unknown plan to try stealing a Nazi Enigma machine during the operation. In her book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, she details how the British military planned to send a small group of German refugees disguised as soldiers into a hotel used by Nazi commanders, where they would steal the much-coveted machine and any codebooks to go along with it. The idea was that the Germans would be so preoccupied with the battle that the undercover refugees could slip in and out unnoticed. But the botched attack was so disastrous that the plan was never carried out. Garrett learned about the clandestine mission after discovering an after-action report written by one of the refugees tasked with carrying out the operation. At the time, German attacks on merchant ships were threatening to devastate the Allied war effort, and being able to decode the Nazis' communications would be a major advantage. Codebreaker Milton Keynes had partially decrypted an Enigma machine the previous year, but the Germans had switched to a more complex machine with a much more difficult code. Unfortunately for the Allies, they probably couldn't have chosen a worse way for trying to get their hands on one. Thanks for watching. Which one of these mysterious projects were you most interested in? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.